Laying hands on a one-percenter's motorcycle is a guaranteed fast track to a broken jaw, or worse. So when Boone, a 30-year veteran of the Hells Angels, found a piece of folded notebook paper jammed between the clutch cable and the handlebar of his custom road glide, he was ready to crack skulls. But the words scrawled in cheap blue ink didn't come from a rival club or a disgruntled cop. They came from a 12-year-old ghost of a girl who had run out of options, asking for monsters to chase her monsters away. The asphalt outside the rusty anchor always smelled like stale beer, baked piss, and hot tar. It was a Tuesday afternoon in August, the kind of day where the heat pressed down on the Ohio Valley like a wet wool blanket. Boone pushed the heavy steel door of the bar open, squinting against the harsh glare of the sun. He was a man built like a cinder-block wall, wrapped in faded denim and heavy black leather. His knees popped audibly as he stepped off the curb, a souvenir from a wreck outside Amarillo a decade prior. He didn't walk with a swagger. Men who had survived as long as he had in the Hells Angels didn't need to swagger. The bottom rocker on his back patch told anyone who mattered exactly who he was, and the rest of the world knew enough to get out of his way. Boone dug a crumpled pack of Marlboros from his chest pocket, struck a match against his zipper, and lit a cigarette. He exhaled a thick cloud of gray smoke, his pale blue eyes scanning the row of bikes parked in perfect uniform diagonal lines. And then he stopped. Something was wrong with his bike. His 2018 Road Glide, a machine he had torn down to the frame and rebuilt with his own calloused hands, had been altered. Not damaged. Altered. There was a piece of white, wide-ruled notebook paper wedged tightly behind the clutch lever. Boone felt the familiar, cold spike of adrenaline hit his chest. You do not touch a club member's bike. It was an unspoken rule recognized by every criminal, cop, and civilian with half a brain in the county. Touching a bike meant you were looking for a fight, issuing a threat, or leaving a warning. He didn't run to the bike. He walked, heavy and deliberate, his eyes sweeping the empty parking lot, checking the sight lines from the rusted-out shell of the old textile mill across the street. Nothing moved except a stray cat darting under a dumpster. Boone stepped up to the road glide. He didn't see wires. He didn't smell explosives. He reached out with two thick, grease-stained fingers and pulled the paper free. It was folded in half. The paper was cheap, the kind that tore easily at the binder rings. Boone flipped it open. He expected a court summons. He expected a threat from the rival club up north. He did not expect the jagged, uneven handwriting of a child. My name is Lily. I am 12. I live in the brick house on 4th Street. The one with the dead grass. People say you guys are bad. People say you hurt people. My dad had a bike like this one before he died. He said bikers look out for their own. I need someone bad to walk me to school on Friday. They won't stop hurting me. They broke my glasses. I will give you my allowance. It is $14. Boone stared at the paper. The cigarette burned down to his knuckles, stinging the thick skin. He dropped the butt and ground it out beneath the heel of his engineer boot. He read the note again. The blue ink was smeared in 2 places near the bottom. Teardrops, maybe. Or just sweat from a kid terrified of getting caught touching a Hells Angels motorcycle. The heavy metal door of the bar creaked open again. Garrett stepped out. Garrett was the chapter's vice president, a wiry, high-strung guy with a neck covered in ink and a perpetual scowl. "Everything good, boss?" Garrett asked, his hand instinctively resting on his belt line. He saw the look on Boone's face. It wasn't rage. It was something heavier. Boone didn't say a word. He handed the piece of paper to Garrett. Garrett took it, his eyes scanning the crooked blue letters. He read it once. He read it twice. Then he handed it back, his jaw tight. Some dumb kid's playing a prank, or somebody setting us up to knock on a door we ain't supposed to. "Maybe," Boone grunted, folding the paper and sliding it into his breast pocket right over his heart. "You ain't seriously thinking about going down to 4th Street, are you?" Garrett asked, crossing his arms. "That's the county foster home, Boone. The group house. Place is a dumping ground for the state's messes. Cops are always over there for runaways. We show up, they're going to think we're peddling something." Boone straddled the road glide. He turned the ignition switch and hit the starter. The massive V-twin engine roared to life, a deep guttural thunder that shook the pavement. He looked at Garrett over the vibration of the handlebars. $14 is a lot of money, Garrett, Boone said, his voice barely rising over the idle of the engine. We're going for a ride. The county group home on 4th Street looked exactly the way a system designed by indifferent bureaucrats would look. It was a massive 2-story brick colonial that had seen its best days during the Eisenhower administration. The gutters were sagging, choked with rotting leaves from the previous autumn. The front yard was a patchwork of dirt and crabgrass, heavily rutted where delivery trucks had jumped the curb. 3 Harley Davidsons pulled up to the curb, their engines cutting out in a synchronized, echoing silence. Boone, Garrett, and a younger prospect named Mitch kicked their stands down. The neighborhood was quiet, the oppressive afternoon heat keeping most people indoors behind drawn shades and humming window AC units. Boone unclipped his helmet and hung it on the mirror. He walked up the cracked concrete path, his heavy boots crunching on broken glass and dried mud. Garrett and Mitch flanked him. 3 men wrapped in club patches, leather and chains, standing on the porch of a government-run home for abandoned youth. It was a picture of a collision between 2 worlds that usually avoided each other at all costs. Boone pressed the doorbell. It didn't ring. He knocked, a heavy, dull thud of knuckles against peeling white paint. A moment later, the door jerked open. A woman in her late 40s stood there, holding a stack of manila folders against her chest like a shield. She wore a tired cardigan despite the heat, her hair pulled into a messy graying bun. Her eyes widened, instantly darting to the patches on their chests, then to the bikes on the curb, then back to Boone's face. "We don't want any trouble," she said, her voice tight, a practiced defense mechanism. "Neither do we, ma'am," Boone said. His voice was gravel, but the volume was low, regulated. "You run this place?" "I'm the managing caseworker, Brenda," she said, not relaxing her grip on the folders. "Whatever you're selling, we don't have the budget. Whatever somebody owes you, they aren't here." "Looking for a girl named Lily," Boone said, ignoring her assumptions. 12 years old. Brenda's defensive posture hardened into outright hostility. "Absolutely not. I don't know who you people are, but you have no business with any of my kids. I'll call the police right now." Garrett shifted his weight, clearly agitated, but Boone held up a single thick finger, silencing him. "Brenda, nobody is here to cause a problem," Boone said, reaching slowly into his pocket. He pulled out the folded, grease-stained notebook paper and handed it to her. "She left this on my bike, parked outside the Anchor." Brenda hesitated, then snatched the paper. Her eyes scanned the page. As she read, the hostility in her face drained, replaced by a profound, exhausted sadness. She sighed, her shoulders dropping. She actually did it, Brenda muttered to herself. She looked back up at Boone, her expression softer, but cynical. "You came all the way down here because of a kid's note?" "She said her dad wrote," Boone stated. "She said she was getting hurt." "Lily is." "A difficult case," Brenda said, stepping out onto the porch and pulling the door mostly shut behind her, giving them privacy from the house. "She's been in the system since she was 6. Mom overdosed. Dad caught a bad stretch of highway on his bike a year later. She's been bounced from 4 different homes. She's defensive, prickly. And the kids at the middle school," Brenda stopped, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "Kids are cruel. When they find out you're a ward of the state, you become a target. They wait for her at the bus stop. They corner her in the alleys behind the school. I've called the principal. I've called the cops. Nothing changes because there's no proof, and Lily refuses to name names anymore. Because when she does, it gets worse." "They broke her glasses," Boone said. It wasn't a question. "Yesterday," Brenda nodded, looking at the dirty porch floor. "Stomped them into the pavement. I don't have the budget to replace them until next quarter. She's taping them together." Boone stared at the rotting wood of the doorframe. The world was full of victims. You couldn't save them all. It was a harsh truth that anyone who lived on the streets understood. If you bled for everyone, You'd bleed out. But there was something about a kid recognizing the inherent danger of a biker club and deciding that was exactly the kind of venom she needed to fight her own poison. It demanded respect. "Bring her out," Boone said. Brenda hesitated. "Look, she's got enough trauma having a biker gang show up." "Motorcycle club," Garrett corrected sharply. Boone shot Garrett a look. "Bring her out, Brenda. We just want to talk to her for 2 minutes, right here on the porch." Brenda weighed her options, looked at the note in her hand again, and sighed. She went back inside. 2 minutes later, the door opened. Lily stepped out. She was small for 12, painfully thin. She wore a faded, oversized t-shirt that had once belonged to a high school track team she didn't run for, and jeans that were frayed at the hems. Her sneakers were gray, worn smooth on the bottoms, with a strip of silver duct tape holding the right toe together. On her face rested a pair of plastic-framed glasses, leaning heavily to the left, held together at the bridge with thick white medical tape. She looked at the three men. She didn't cower. She didn't hide behind Brenda. She stood with her arms crossed, her chin tilted up in a practiced look of defiance. It was a look Boone had seen on 100 men serving life sentences in maximum security. It was the armor of someone who had nothing left to lose. "You actually came," Lily said. Her voice didn't waver. "You touched my bike," Boone said, his face a deadpan mask. "I didn't scratch the paint," Lily shot back. "I slid it behind the cable. I know how to treat a bike." Boone crouched down, his bad knee popping loudly. He leveled his eyes with hers. He could see the faint yellowing of a fading bruise on her left cheekbone. "Why'd you write the note, Lily?" Boone asked. "I wrote it," she said, her eyes flicking to Garrett and Mitch, then back to Boone. "Because the boys in the 8th grade are bigger than me. Because they knocked me into the drainage ditch yesterday and said garbage belongs in the gutter. Because my dad told me once that the Hells Angels were the baddest men on the planet. I figured if the baddest men on the planet walked me to the front doors, the 8th graders would leave me alone." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled wad of bills. A 5, someone's, and a handful of quarters. She held it out to him. "I told you I had $14. It's yours. Just walk me to school on Friday morning." Boone looked at the money in her small, dirty palm. He didn't take it. He stood up slowly. "Keep your money, kid," Boone said. Lily's defiance cracked for a fraction of a second, a flash of profound disappointment crossing her eyes. She thought she was being rejected. She thought she wasn't worth the effort. She started to pull her hand back. "Keep it," Boone repeated, his voice hardening into something resonant and absolute. "Because walking you to school on Friday is going to be free of charge. You be standing on this porch at 7:30 a.m. sharp. Don't be late." He didn't wait for her to say thank you. He didn't offer a hug. He turned around, walked down the cracked path, threw his leg over his Harley, and fired the engine. The Hells Angels clubhouse was located on the outskirts of town, sitting on 3 acres of industrial zoning wrapped in chain-link fence and razor wire. Inside, the main room was a cavern of concrete and corrugated steel, smelling perpetually of stale beer, motor oil, and tobacco. At the center of the room sat the table, a massive slab of oak, deeply scarred and burned over decades, surrounded by heavy wooden chairs. It was Wednesday night. Church. The mandatory weekly meeting for all fully patched members. Boone sat at the head of the table. The gavel rested near his right hand. Around him sat 25 men. These were not men who made a living behind desks. They were mechanics, welders, long-haul truckers, and men who operated in the gray areas of the law. They were hardened, cynical, and fiercely loyal to the patch on their backs and the men sitting beside them. The business of the club was handled methodically. Treasurer's report, dues, run schedules, updates on a brother doing time in the state penitentiary. "Any new business?" Boone asked, his voice cutting through the ambient hum of the exhaust fans. The room was quiet. Men took drags from their cigarettes or sips from long-neck bottles. "I got something," Boone said. He reached into his pocket and placed the piece of notebook paper on the oak table. He slid it down the center. "Garrett, read it out loud." Garrett picked up the paper, cleared his throat, and read Lily's words to the room. The men listened. Nobody laughed, nobody interrupted. When Garrett finished, he dropped the paper back onto the table. "A kid," a heavily bearded member named Chib said from the far end of the table. "A 12-year-old kid left that on your sled." "Yeah," Boone said. "Her name is Lily, ward of the state. Dad was a rider. She's getting beat on by a pack of cowards at the middle school. They broke her glasses, shoved her in a ditch." A low murmur rolled through the room. There is a universal code among men who live outside the bounds of polite society. You fight men who choose to fight. You don't lay hands on women, and you sure as hell don't lay hands on children. "I told her we'd walk her to school on Friday," Boone continued. "Just me, Garrett, and Mitch." Three guys. Sully, the sergeant-at-arms, spoke up. He was a mountain of a man with a scarred jaw. "Three guys is a statement, Boone, but it ain't a message." "What are you saying, Sully?" Boone asked, leaning back in his chair. "I'm saying if we're going to do this, we do it the way we do everything," Sully said, placing his massive hands flat on the table. "We don't tiptoe. We make the ground shake. Those kids at the school, they need to know that this girl isn't a throwaway. They need to know she belongs to somebody. And if she belongs to the club, she belongs to all of us." "We bring the whole chapter," another member chimed in. "All 25 of us." Boone looked around the table. He saw the fire in their eyes. They were outcasts. They knew what it felt like to be pushed to the fringes, to be told they were garbage. They saw themselves in that little girl with taped-up glasses and duct-taped shoes. 25 is a good number," Boone said slowly. He picked up his phone from the table. "But I've got the chapter presidents from the Dayton charter, the Columbus charter, and the River guys in Kentucky in my contacts. I'm betting they hate bullies just as much as we do." A slow, collective grin spread around the oak table. "Sully," Boone ordered, "get on the horn. Call the neighboring charters. Tell them we got a special escort run on Friday morning. Kickstands up at 7 a.m. "How many guys are you looking to pull, boss?" Sully asked, already reaching for his phone. "Every single one who can ride," Boone said, picking up the gavel. He slammed it down on the wood. The sharp crack echoed off the steel walls. Church is dismissed. Word travels fast in the 1% motorcycle community. It moves through text messages, encrypted calls, and word of mouth in garages across state lines. The story wasn't complicated. An orphaned kid whose dad used to ride was getting tortured, and she asked the Hells Angels for help. By Thursday night, the cheap motels on the edge of town were completely booked. The parking lots were filled with chrome and steel. Men with leather cuts bearing different bottom rockers rolled into the county, paying for their own gas, taking off work, leaving their own families, all for a girl they had never met. When Friday morning broke, the air was crisp, the humidity having broken overnight. A heavy layer of fog clung to the asphalt. At 6:30 a.m., the staging area, an abandoned Kmart parking lot a mile from the foster home, began to fill. It started as a low rumble in the distance. Then, the sound grew. It wasn't just noise, it was a physical force. It rattled the plexiglass bus stops. It vibrated in the chests of the early morning commuters who pulled their cars over to the shoulder, staring in awe. They rolled in. Not 25, not 50. 150 Hells Angels. They rode in tight, staggered formations, their headlights cutting through the morning mist like a localized invasion force. They rode baggers, choppers, and club-style Dynas. The smell of high-octane fuel, burnt oil, and exhaust fumes blanketed the staging area. Boone sat on his road glide at the front of the lot. He watched as chapter after chapter pulled in, lining up in immaculate rows. Men he had bled with, men he had fought beside, men who looked like modern-day barbarians, covered in grease, ink, and scars. Sully idled up next to Boone. He had to yell over the deafening mechanical roar of 150 V-twin engines. "We got boys from 3 states here, Boone," Sully shouted, pointing back at the sea of leather and chrome. Boone looked at his watch. 7:15 a.m. He didn't give a speech. He didn't need to. He simply raised his left arm high in the air, his gloved fist balled tight. He pumped it forward twice. 150 men kicked their bikes into gear. The collective clunk of heavy transmissions engaging sounded like the cocking of a massive gun. Boone rolled the throttle back, and the pack moved out. They were heading for 4th Street. They were heading for the brick house, and they were about to bring hell to middle school. The brick colonial on 4th Street was usually silent at 7:30 in the morning. The neighborhood was a tired stretch of working-class homes where people left early for shift work and kept their blinds drawn. Brenda stood on the sagging wooden porch, clutching a thermal travel mug of black coffee like it was a lifeline. Lily stood next to her. The girl was dressed in the same frayed jeans, but she had tried to clean her gray sneakers with a wet paper towel. Her taped glasses sat crooked on her nose. She clutched a faded canvas backpack tight against her chest. She kept looking down the empty street, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "Lily, it's getting late," Brenda said gently. "The bus comes in 10 minutes. Maybe they got held up, or maybe—" Brenda didn't want to finish the sentence. She didn't want to say that grown men who lived outside the law didn't keep promises to 12-year-old wards of the state. "He said 7:30, Lily said stubbornly. Her voice was firm, but her knuckles were white where they gripped the canvas straps. Then, the coffee in Brenda's mug began to vibrate. It started as a low, guttural frequency beneath the pavement. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a physical sensation that rattled the loose window panes of the old house. Brenda frowned, looking toward the southern intersection. A dog across the street started barking frantically, then tucked its tail and bolted under a rusted Chevy pickup. The low rumble swelled into a mechanical roar. Around the corner, a single headlight cut through the lingering morning fog. It was Boone's Road Glide. Brenda let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "Okay, they came." But Boone didn't turn onto 4th Street alone. Behind him, side by side, rode Garrett and Sully, and behind them was a wall of chrome, steel, and black leather. They kept coming. They poured around the corner like a localized storm, a seemingly endless procession of heavy machinery. The noise was absolute, a deafening, chest-compressing thunder that swallowed the neighborhood whole. Brenda took a step back, her back hitting the peeling paint of the front door. She had spent 15 years in social work, dealing with broken homes, aggressive addicts, and angry parents. She had never been truly terrified until this moment. 150 Hells Angels were rolling down her street. The procession stretched for blocks. They filled the 2-lane residential road completely. Neighbors in bathrobes cautiously pushed their front doors open, staring in wide-eyed disbelief. A garbage truck, half a block down, hastily threw it into reverse and backed into a side alley to get out of the way. Boone pulled up to the curb directly in front of the house. He kicked his stand down. Behind him, the rolling thunder shifted into a deep, synchronized idle. 150 heavy engines chugging in an uneven, rhythmic heartbeat that shook the dirt out of the gutters. Lily didn't step back. She stepped forward. She walked down the cracked concrete path, her gray sneakers silent under the deafening noise. Boone killed his engine. The men immediately behind him did the same. The silence that rippled backward through the pack was almost as heavy as the noise had been. Boone swung his heavy boot over the saddle and stood up. He walked to the chain-link fence. He didn't smile. He looked exactly as menacing as he had on Tuesday. "You ready, kid?" Boone asked, his voice rough. Lily nodded. She looked past him, her eyes widening at the sheer volume of men sitting on their bikes, stretching all the way back to the traffic light. They were giant men, heavily bearded, scarred, wearing sunglasses that hid their eyes. They looked like monsters. They were her monsters. A heavy-set biker named Reno with a gray beard braided to his chest stepped off his Dyna. He walked up to the fence carrying something black in his massive hands. He handed it to Boone without a word. Boone turned back to Lily. He held up a small black leather vest. It wasn't a club cut. It had no patches, no rockers. It was just a heavy, durable piece of motorcycle leather, sized for a small woman or a teenager. Nights get cold, Boone said simply. He held it out. Lily dropped her backpack on the dirt. She turned around, slipping her thin arms through the armholes of the heavy leather. It was slightly too big, hanging down past her belt line, but the weight of it was immediate. It felt like armor. Boone stepped back and pointed to his road glide. You asked for a walk, but it's 1.5 miles to the school. We ain't walking. You're riding shotgun. Lily picked up her backpack, walked through the rusty gate, and stood next to the massive motorcycle. Boone climbed on, settling into the worn leather seat. He pointed to the passenger peg. Left foot on the peg, grab my shoulder, swing your right leg over, he instructed. Lily followed his directions. She hauled herself up and settled onto the passenger pillion. She felt the intense heat radiating from the massive engine block beneath her right leg. Che, hold on to the belt loops, Boone said, looking at her in the rearview mirror. You let go, you fall off. You fall off. I'm not turning around to pick you up. It was a lie, and every man within earshot knew it. Lily wrapped her small hands tightly around the thick leather belt loops on the sides of Boone's denim jeans. Boone hit the ignition. The road glide roared to life. He raised his left hand, holding 2 fingers in the air, and rolled them forward in a circular motion. Behind them, 150 engines fired in unison. The thunder returned, louder than before. Boone engaged the heavy clutch, dropped it into first gear with a solid thud, and rolled off the curb. Moving a pack of 150 motorcycles through a mid-sized Ohio town during the morning rush hour is a logistical nightmare. It requires precision, aggression, and a complete disregard for traffic laws. They rode 2 abreast. Boone rode at the front, taking the left lane position, with Sully to his right. Lily sat behind Boone, her face shielded from the wind by his massive frame. She looked to her left and right. The world was moving by in a blur of storefronts and morning commuters. They approached the intersection of Main and 7th, a busy 4-way light. The light was red. Boone didn't slow down. He tapped his brakes twice. From the middle of the pack, 2 riders on stripped-down, aggressive-looking Dynas gunned their engines, peeling out of formation. They rocketed past Boone on either side, accelerating into the intersection. They hit the brakes hard, sliding their heavy bikes sideways to block the cross-traffic completely. They planted their boots on the asphalt, raising their left hands palm out at the oncoming cars. It was a standard road guard maneuver. No commuter argued. The minivans and sedans slammed on their brakes, their drivers staring in shock as the endless column of Hell's Angels blew through the red light. Lily watched it happen. She saw a man in a business suit inside a silver Lexus grip his steering wheel tight, his mouth hanging open as the thunder rolled past his front bumper. She saw a woman at a bus stop drop her newspaper. For 12 years, Lily had been invisible. She was a file in a state cabinet. She was a target in the hallway. She was a problem to be managed. Right now, she was the center of the universe. The heat of the engine beneath her, the smell of burning oil, the heavy bass of the exhausts vibrating in her chest, it all fused into a profound sense of safety. She looked at the leather vest covering her arms. She looked at the men riding strictly in formation behind them. They rode with a disciplined military precision. There was no hot-dogging, no showing off. They were executing an objective. As they moved through the downtown corridor, a local police cruiser pulled out of an alley, its light bar flashing a single tentative red and blue rotation. The cruiser pulled up alongside the middle of the pack, matching their speed. Lily felt a brief spike of panic, but the pack didn't scatter. They didn't speed up. The riders closest to the cruiser simply turned their heads, their mirrored sunglasses locking onto the officer behind the wheel. The sheer mass of the formation squeezed the cruiser toward the curb. It wasn't an overt threat, it was simple physics. A 2-ton Ford Explorer was no match for 150 heavy motorcycles moving as a single coordinated organism. The officer seemed to calculate the odds, realize he had exactly 0 jurisdiction over a moving wall of iron, and turned his light bar off. He pulled over to the shoulder and let them pass. Sully, riding next to Boone, caught Lily's eye in his mirror. The scarred, terrifying giant of a man offered her a single slow wink. They turned onto Oak Street. The middle school was half a mile away. The traffic bottlenecked as minivans and SUVs lined up for the standard morning drop-off. Parents were creeping along, drinking coffee, yelling at their kids to grab their gym bags. Boone downshifted, the aggressive bark of his engine echoing off the brick facades of the surrounding houses. He didn't wait in the line of cars. Boone cut the handlebars hard to the left, crossing the double yellow line into the oncoming lane. Sully followed. 150 bikes followed. They bypassed the quarter-mile line of idling minivans, rolling directly toward the front entrance of the school. The parents in the drop-off line rolled their windows down. Cell phones appeared, recording the spectacle. Nobody honked. Nobody complained about them cutting the line. The sheer audacity of the invasion demanded silence. Up ahead, the sprawling mid-century architecture of the middle school loomed. The front lawn was a chaotic swarm of teenagers carrying backpacks, talking and shoving each other. Lily's grip on Boone's belt loops tightened. Her knuckles ached. This was it. The place where the nightmares happened. Westview Middle School had a semicircular driveway reserved exclusively for school buses. Painted in heavy, bright yellow letters across the asphalt were the words, "Buses only, no parking." Boone rolled his road glide directly over the bright yellow letters and parked it dead center in front of the main concrete steps. He kicked his stand down and killed the engine. Behind him, the pack swarmed the driveway. They didn't park in neat lines. They flooded the zone. They parked on the grass, over the curbs, and across the crosswalks. It was a calculated, deliberate occupation of the space. One by one, the engines cut out. The sudden silence that fell over the schoolyard was heavier than the noise. 300 kids stopped talking. Teachers holding clipboards froze on the sidewalks. The idling engines of the school buses sounded weak and hollow in comparison to the mechanical beasts that now surrounded them. Boone swung off his bike. He didn't look at the crowd of terrified teenagers. He walked around to the passenger side and held out a hand. Lily took it. She slid off the bike, her sneakers hitting the pavement. She adjusted the oversized leather vest. Her taped glasses were still crooked. "Where do they wait for you?" Boone asked, his voice low, strictly between him and the girl. Lily pointed toward a cluster of oak trees near the edge of the bike racks. "Over there, by the brick wall." Boone looked. A group of 4 older boys, 8th graders, were standing by the wall. They wore brand-name sneakers and expensive athletic hoodies. They were the apex predators of the middle school ecosystem. Right now, they looked like cornered mice. One of them, a tall kid with a mop of curly hair named Tyler, was staring wide-eyed at Boone. Tyler was the one who had stomped on Lily's glasses. Boone turned back to his men. He didn't shout. He just nodded his head toward the brick wall. Garrett, Sully, Reno, and a dozen other men detached themselves from their bikes. They didn't rush. They walked with that slow, heavy, deliberate, menacing stride. The silver chains on their leather wallets clinked against their denim. Heavy engineer boots crunched on the gravel. The crowd of students parted like the Red Sea. They scrambled backwards, pressing themselves against the chain-link fences in the brick facade of the school, desperate to get out of the way. Boone placed a heavy hand on Lily's shoulder. "Walk." Lily walked. For the first time in her life, she didn't look at the ground. She kept her chin up. She walked shoulder to shoulder with a man who had survived prison riots and highway shootouts. Flanking them were giants covered in ink and leather. They approached the brick wall. The 4 boys didn't run. They couldn't. Their legs seemed paralyzed by the sheer, unfiltered intimidation radiating from the men walking toward them. Boone stopped 2 feet away from Tyler. The boy was breathing fast, his chest heaving under his expensive hoodie. He looked up at Boone, his eyes darting frantically to the other men surrounding him. Reno stood to his left, arms crossed, his massive biceps straining against his shirt. Sully stood to his right, casually cracking his knuckles, the sound like dry branches snapping. Boone didn't touch the boy. He didn't raise his fist. He just leaned down, bringing his face inches from Tyler's. Boone smelled like stale smoke, old leather, and violence. "You got a problem with my girl's glasses?" Boone asked. His voice was barely a whisper. It was a raspy, damaged sound. Tyler shook his head frantically. He couldn't speak. His throat worked, but no sound came out. "I didn't hear you," Boone whispered. "No, sir," Tyler choked out, his voice cracking. "No problem." "Good," Boone said, straightening up. "Because if I hear she trips, if I hear somebody bumps into her in the hallway, if I hear somebody looks at her wrong in the cafeteria, I know where this school is now, and I don't have a day job." Boone stared at the boys for 5 agonizing seconds. He let the silence stretch until it was suffocating. Then he turned his back on them. It was a show of utter disrespect, a clear message that they weren't even worth his time to keep an eye on. He looked down at Lily. "Go to class," Boone said. Lily looked at the terrified boys against the wall. She looked at the hundreds of students staring at her in absolute awe. She was untouchable. The ghost had become a god. She turned back to Boone. She didn't hug him. That wasn't how this worked. She reached up, grabbed the lapels of her oversized leather vest, and adjusted it on her shoulders. "Thank you," she said. "Keep the vest," Boone grunted. He turned around and walked back through the parted sea of teenagers toward his road glide. Sully, Garrett, and the others fell in behind him. They mounted their bikes. Lily stood by the brick wall and watched. 150 engines fired up, shattering the quiet of the suburban morning once again. They pulled out of the bus lane, their exhausts barking as they accelerated down the street, leaving behind a thick cloud of blue smoke and the smell of high-octane fuel. Lily stood there until the sound faded completely, replaced by the ringing bell of the first period. She turned around. The 4 boys pressed against the wall, immediately flinched, shrinking back as she looked at them. Lily didn't say a word. She just adjusted her taped-up glasses, tightened the straps of her canvas backpack, and walked through the front doors of the school. Nobody was ever going to push her into a ditch again. The heavy glass doors of Westview Middle School hissed shut behind Lily, cutting off the lingering smell of exhaust fumes. Inside, the main hallway was bathed in harsh, flickering fluorescent light. It smelled of industrial floor wax, old paper, and institutional bleach. Usually this hallway was a gauntlet. It was where shoulders checked her into lockers, where whispered insults followed her to homeroom. Today, it was a ghost town. The bell had rung, but nobody was moving to class. Students lined the walls, their backpacks slung over one shoulder, staring. The teachers, holding their travel mugs of coffee, stood in the doorways of their classrooms, equally paralyzed. Word had spread through the front windows before Lily even hit the steps. Lily walked down the center of the linoleum floor. The squeak of her gray, duct-taped sneakers echoed in the unnatural silence. She didn't take off the leather vest. It was heavy, weighing down her thin shoulders, trapping the late August heat against her t-shirt. She didn't care. It felt like a shield forged from iron. She walked past the row of blue lockers. A group of girls who usually giggled at her frayed jeans pressed themselves against the metal doors, their eyes glued to the black leather dragging past her waist. Mr. Harrison, the school principal, stood outside the main office. He was a balding man in a cheap beige suit who preferred administrative harmony over actual conflict resolution. He had ignored Brenda's phone calls for months, citing a lack of actionable evidence regarding the bullying. He wasn't ignoring anything today. He looked pale. He looked out the window toward the empty bus lane, then down at Lily. "Lily," Mr. Harrison said, his voice tight. "My office, now please." Lily stopped. 6 months ago, a summons to the principal's office would have triggered a panic attack. She would have apologized for something she didn't do. She would have stared at her shoes. Now, she looked up through her taped, crooked glasses. She remembered the sheer, unapologetic silence of Boone turning his back on Tyler. "I have first period math," Lily said. Her voice didn't shake. "Math can wait," Mr. Harrison insisted, stepping forward, trying to project an authority he clearly didn't feel. "We need to discuss what just happened outside. Who were those men?" "They're my friends," Lily said. They parked on the school crosswalk, Lily. They threatened students. Nobody got threatened, Lily replied evenly. They just gave me a ride and told people to be polite. She didn't wait for him to argue. She adjusted the heavy leather lapels, turned her back on the principal, and walked into room 104. Mr. Harrison didn't follow her. Across town, the rusty anchor was dead quiet. The morning sun cut through the dusty front windows, illuminating the motes of dust dancing over the pool tables. Boone sat in a booth in the back corner. A mug of black coffee sat untouched in front of him. Garrett and Sully sat across the table. The rest of the pack had dispersed, heading back to their jobs, their garages, or the highway back to Kentucky and Columbus. The invasion was over. Sully leaned back, the scarred leather of his cut creaking. He pulled a toothpick from his pocket and stuck it in the corner of his mouth. "You think it worked?" Sully asked. "Kids are cowards," Garrett muttered, staring into his coffee. "They hunt in packs. You show them a bigger pack, they find a new hobby. She'll be fine." Boone didn't say anything. He pulled the crumpled piece of wide-ruled notebook paper from his breast pocket. He smoothed it out on the sticky Formica tabletop. He read the jagged blue ink again. "I will give you my allowance. It is $14. "It ain't just about today," Boone said, his voice a low gravel. "The school board is going to call CPS. CPS is going to call Brenda. They're going to say a ward of the state is associating with a known criminal enterprise. They're going to try to move her." "They move her, she loses whatever ground she just gained," Sully noted, his jaw tightening. "System just shuffles the deck, deals the kid another bad hand." Boone folded the paper carefully and slid it back into his pocket. He looked out the dirty window at his road glide parked on the curb. "They ain't moving her," Boone said. It was a statement of fact. "Not unless I say so." Later that afternoon, Brenda's phone rang at the county group home. It was a caseworker from the state office, her tone clipped and bureaucratic. "Brenda, we received a highly disturbing report from Westview Middle. Something about a motorcycle gang." Brenda looked out the window. The street was empty now, but she could still see the faint tire marks on the asphalt. She thought about the look on Lily's face when she walked out the door that morning, terrified, desperate. And she thought about the way the girl had looked sitting on the back of that massive bike, anchored, safe. "It was a community outreach program," Brenda lied smoothly. She leaned back in her desk chair. "A local riding club heard about the severe bullying Lily was enduring, the bullying the school failed to address. They offered a police-escorted ride to boost her morale." "Police-escorted?" the caseworker asked, skeptical. "Nah. An officer was on the scene," Brenda stated. It was technically true. The cruiser had been there. It just got pushed to the shoulder. "If the state wants to open an inquiry into why a 12-year-old had to rely on a motorcycle club to stop physical assaults on school grounds, I have a file of unanswered complaints ready to fax to the local news." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Bureaucrats hated bad PR more than they hated rule-breaking. "Just keep her away from them, Brenda," the caseworker finally sighed. "We don't need the liability." Brenda hung up the phone. She knew she couldn't keep Lily away from them, and looking at the heavy black leather vest now draped carefully over the back of Lily's dining room chair, she realized she didn't want to. October hit the Ohio Valley with a bitter, damp chill. The leaves turned brown and dropped, clogging the gutters of the brick house on 4th Street. Things had changed for Lily. The bullying hadn't just stopped, it had evaporated. The 8th graders gave her a wide berth in the hallways. When she sat down in the cafeteria, nobody bumped her tray. She didn't have many friends. She was still the quiet, prickly kid from the group home. But she had peace. Every Friday, without fail, a single Harley Davidson would idle at the curb at 7:30 a.m. Sometimes it was Garrett. Sometimes it was Sully. Usually, it was Boone. They didn't bring the army again. They didn't need to. The presence of one leather-clad giant leaning against a fence post was enough to remind the entire neighborhood who was watching. Lily would walk out, climb onto the back, and ride to school. She never offered the $14 again. They never asked for it. On a Tuesday evening, 2 months after the ride, Boone was pulling the primary cover off a busted soft ale in the club's garage. His hands were coated in black grease. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He wiped his hands on a filthy red rag and fished the phone out. It was Brenda. "She won't go to school," Brenda said. Her voice sounded exhausted. Boone frowned. "Somebody touch her?" "No, nothing like that," Brenda sighed. "We had mandatory vision screenings yesterday. The school nurse flagged her. Her prescription is completely shot, and the glasses, well, they're mostly medical tape at this point. The nurse said she can't read the board. State funding for optical doesn't kick in until January. I told her she has to go anyway. She locked herself in the bathroom. She's embarrassed, Boone. She won't wear the broken ones anymore, and she can't see without them." Boone hung up without saying goodbye. He walked to the sink, scrubbed his hands with heavy-duty pumice soap, and grabbed his keys. 20 minutes later, Boone kicked the front door of the brick house open. He didn't knock. Brenda stood in the hallway, startled, holding a stack of towels. "Where is she?" Boone grunted. Brenda pointed up the stairs. "First door on the right." Boone's heavy boots thudded against the worn carpet of the stairs. He walked to the bathroom door. It was locked. He didn't knock. He hit the door with the flat of his palm, a heavy, rattling impact. "Grab your coat, kid," Boone said through the cheap wood. Silence. "I ain't asking," Boone added. A moment later, the lock clicked. The door opened a few inches. Lily stood there, looking at the floor. Without her taped-up glasses, her eyes looked smaller, vulnerable. "I can't see," she mumbled. "I look stupid." "You look like a kid who needs glasses," Boone said. He turned and walked down the hall. "Get in the truck." He had brought his beat-up Ford F-15 instead of the bike. Lily climbed into the passenger seat, wrapping the oversized leather vest around herself. Boone slammed the truck into gear and drove toward the commercial strip on the edge of town. He pulled into the parking lot of an upscale optometrist's office, the kind of place with hardwood floors and designer frames and glass display cases. Lily hung back as they walked through the glass doors. The receptionist, a young woman in a sleek blazer, looked up. Her polite smile faltered as a towering, scarred man in heavy leather boots and a faded denim cut walked to the counter. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her hand instinctively moving toward the desk phone. "She needs an exam," Boone said, hooking his thumb toward Lily. "And new glasses. Today." "Do you have an appointment? Or insurance?" the woman asked nervously. Boone reached into his back pocket. He pulled out a thick roll of $20 bills held together with a rubber band. He dropped it on the pristine glass counter with a heavy thud. "We don't have an appointment," Boone said, his pale blue eyes locking onto hers. "We got cash, and we're in a hurry." 45 minutes later, Lily was sitting in a leather chair, staring into a mirror. Resting on her nose was a pair of sleek, black rectangular frames. No tape, no scratches. The world was sharp, clear, and perfectly defined. Boone stood by the door, arms crossed, watching her. "How do they look?" she asked, her voice quiet. "They look like you can see the chalkboard," Boone replied flatly. "Now let's go. I got a transmission to rebuild." It wasn't a fairy tale. Boone didn't become her legal guardian. He didn't adopt her. He was a 1% biker with a rap sheet, and she was a ward of the state. The lines between their worlds remained rigidly drawn by the law. But the law doesn't dictate family. Over the next 4 years, the Hells Angels became the shadow hovering over Lily's life. When the group home boiler broke in the dead of winter and the county dragged its feet, 3 bikers showed up with a commercial space heater and a toolbox fixing the furnace before the state inspector even filed the paperwork. When Lily turned 15 and needed to learn how to drive, Brenda didn't have the time. Sully took her out to the empty Kmart parking lot in his beat-up Chevy Tahoe, barking orders about blind spots and parallel parking until she could do it flawlessly. She grew taller. The heavy leather vest Boone had given her began to fit perfectly. She wore it over hoodies, over flannel shirts, and eventually over her high school Letterman jacket. She wasn't a biker. She was a straight-A student. She ran track. She kept her head down and did the work. But she carried herself with the heavy, unbothered confidence of someone who knew exactly what kind of monsters stood behind her. The football stadium at Westview High School was packed. It was late May, 6 years after the note was left on the road glide. The evening air was warm, smelling of cut grass and cheap concessions. Graduation night. Hundreds of folding chairs were arranged on the turf field. The seniors sat in a sea of maroon caps and gowns. Parents clapped, air horns blasted, and flashbulbs popped as names were called over the crackling PA system. In the very back row of the metal bleachers, far away from the local politicians and the PTA moms, sat a row of men. Boone's hair was more gray than brown now. The lines around his eyes were carved deeper into his face. His bad knee hurt worse in the rain, and he didn't ride as fast as he used to. He sat with his arms crossed, wearing a clean black t-shirt under his cut. Garrett sat to his right, holding a crumpled program. Sully sat to his left, chewing on a toothpick. Behind them sat 10 other fully patched members of the chapter. They didn't cheer. They didn't hold up signs. They just watched. "Lily Adams," the principal announced over the speakers. Lily stood up from her chair on the turf. She wore the maroon gown, but underneath it, visible at the collar, was the thick black leather of a motorcycle vest. She walked across the wooden stage. She took her diploma. She shook the superintendent's hand. As she turned to walk down the steps, she didn't look at the section where the Foster family sat. She didn't look at the teachers. She looked up past the floodlights, toward the very top of the bleachers. Boone met her eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply raised his right hand, 2 fingers extended, and tapped his temple in a silent salute. Lily smiled, a sharp, confident grin, and tapped her own temple in return. After the ceremony, the field flooded with families, tears, hugs, and bouquets of flowers. Lily stood near the edge of the track, holding her diploma. Brenda hugged her tight, crying into her shoulder. "I'm so proud of you," Brenda sobbed. "State College on a full ride. You did it, Lily. You survived it." "We did it," Lily corrected gently. She looked over Brenda's shoulder. The bleachers were emptying out. The row of men in leather cuts was already gone. They didn't do crowds, and they didn't do emotional goodbyes. They had done their job. Lily walked out to the parking lot. The sun had completely set, the street lights casting long orange shadows across the asphalt. Parked under the glow of a sodium light, away from the minivans and sedans, was Boone's Road Glide. He was leaning against the saddlebag, smoking a cigarette. Lily walked up to him. She was 18 now, an adult in the eyes of the state. The foster system was officially behind her. "You clean out your room at the brick house?" Boone asked, exhaling a cloud of gray smoke. "Mostly," Lily said. "Brenda is letting me keep my boxes in the basement until I move into the dorms in August." Boone nodded slowly. He dropped the cigarette and ground it out with his boot. He reached into his deep front pocket and pulled something out. It wasn't money. He held out a set of keys on a plain steel ring. Lily looked at them. "What's this?" "Old Sportster 883, Boone said, his voice flat. "Rebuilt the carb, put new tires on it. It ain't fast and it ain't pretty, but it'll get you from the dorms to class and back. It's parked behind the clubhouse." Lily stared at the keys. Her throat suddenly felt very tight. For 6 years, she had never cried in front of this man. Not when she was terrified, not when she was angry. She felt a tear burn the corner of her eye. She reached out and took the keys. The metal was warm from his hand. "Boone," she started, her voice cracking. "Don't start," Boone grunted, holding up a heavy hand to stop her. "You drop the bike. You pick it up yourself. You need an oil change. You come to the shop and I'll show you how to turn a wrench. I ain't doing it for you." "I know," Lily said, wiping her eye under her glasses. Boone looked at her for a long time. He saw the 12-year-old girl with taped glasses and duct-taped shoes. He saw the survivor. He saw the kid who had the guts to ask a monster for help. He reached out and awkwardly patted her on the shoulder, his heavy hand resting on the black leather of her vest. "You did good, kid," Boone said softly. He turned, threw his leg over the road glide, and fired the engine. The guttural roar echoed off the brick walls of the high school. He didn't look back as he pulled out of the parking lot, shifting into second gear, the red taillight disappearing into the dark Ohio night. Lily stood alone in the parking lot. She gripped the keys tightly in her fist. The night was quiet, but she could still feel the phantom rumble in her chest. She wasn't an orphan anymore. She belonged to the thunder. Some stories prove that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear heavy leather, ride on two wheels, and answer the call when the rest of the world looks away. Lily's journey from a terrified, bullied orphan to a confident young woman was paved by the unexpected loyalty of 150 Hell's Angels who decided she was worth fighting for. If this deeply human story of finding family in the most unlikely of places touched your heart, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that bikers look out for their own, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories.